Have you ever seen something so small, so ordinary, that you just passed right by it, only to later find out it changed everything? Imagine opening a drawer, finding an old crumpled letter in a child's messy handwriting, and realizing you're holding a piece of history. It sounds impossible, right? But that's exactly what happened. This is not just a story about a kid getting teased at school. This is about how one handwritten note, shaky and awkward, written by a boy who barely spoke in class, made its way into one of the most respected institutions in the world, the Smithsonian. And tonight, you're going to find out exactly how that happened. You'll learn what was in the letter, why it mattered, and what secret was hiding behind those uneven letters and misspelled words. You clicked on this video because that headline tugged at your curiosity, and I promise you, you're not leaving disappointed. But listen closely, because every second of this story matters. Every detail leads to a moment that's going to leave you stunned. What this boy wrote changed lives, but more than that, it revealed a truth no one saw coming. Now, before we get into the heart of it, let's talk about something real for a second, because if you've ever been laughed at for something that made you different, you're going to feel this story in your chest. Maybe it was the way you spoke, the clothes you wore, the way your hands shook when you were nervous, or how you always sat in the back so you didn't get called on. We all carry those moments, and for some of us, they never really leave. So when I tell you that this story is about a kid who was bullied because of his handwriting, just that, you're going to see more than just ink on paper. You're going to see yourself. You're going to see how sometimes the thing that makes you a target is the very thing that makes you powerful. And if you stay with me till the end of this video, you'll not only understand how this boy's letter made it to the Smithsonian, but you'll walk away with something a little more powerful than just answers. You'll walk away with the kind of truth that sticks with you. The story begins in a small American town that most people wouldn't be able to find on a map. The kind of place with one blinking traffic light, an aging water tower, and a school cafeteria that still served square pizza on Fridays. In this town lived a boy named Aiden, a quiet, 11-year-old who had a habit of staring out windows during math class and who never quite got the hang of cursive. He was the kind of kid teachers worried about but didn't quite know how to help. He didn't cause trouble, didn't speak out, just sort of blended into the background like pencil marks on a desk. But he had one thing that stood out. His handwriting. And not in a good way. It was messy, slanted, like he was trying to write with his eyes closed. Other kids made fun of it constantly. Notes were passed back and forth mocking how he spelled words like freedom and courage. Aiden never fought back. He just kept writing. And that's what makes this story so incredible. Because one of those letters he kept writing, one that was meant to be just another forgotten school assignment, ended up in front of the right pair of eyes at the exact right moment. A history professor visiting the school for an entirely unrelated reason saw the letter on a bulletin board. He stopped, read it, and felt something strange stir inside him. He asked the principal if he could take a copy. No one thought much of it at the time. But what happened next? Well, let's just say it sent a ripple through the world of American education, social justice, and even politics. Yes, politics. Because someone high up, very high up, read the same words and made a decision that would change Aiden's life forever. The twist? Aiden didn't even know it had happened. Not at first. So, why did this letter matter so much? What was in it? And how could something written by a boy who could barely form his letters shake a nation awake? You're about to find out. This isn't a story just about bullying. It's about something far deeper. A hidden truth wrapped inside a child's raw perspective. A letter that cut through all the noise of social media trends and adult agendas to say something pure, something true. But before we open that letter, before you read what Aiden actually wrote, I need you to stay with me because context matters. The pain that led to those words, the ridicule he endured, and the reason he wrote what he did, all of that will give those ink stains their full meaning. And just as you think you're beginning to understand who Aiden is and what he's all about, something happens that flips everything upside down. One phone call, one news crew, one headline that starts to go viral, first locally, then nationally. Parents start asking questions. Teachers start scrambling. And Aiden? He's just trying to finish his homework. The mystery of how a bullied boy's letter ended up in the Smithsonian isn't just about a museum display. It's about why his words cut through generations of silence. And if you think this is just another feel-good story about overcoming odds, I promise you haven't heard anything yet. Because when you find out who else saw the letter and what they revealed about Aiden's past, you're going to want to go back and reread every word. And that moment, that twist, is just about to unfold. Aiden Walker wasn't the kind of kid who drew attention. He didn't wear flashy sneakers or speak loudly in the hallway. He walked with his shoulders hunched, his backpack sagging from the weight of books he never volunteered to open in class. The teachers at Green Hollow Elementary described him as quietly observant, which was often code for a child slipping through the cracks. He was in 6th grade, and already the weight of different had settled on him like an invisible coat. He never raised his hand, never joined recess games, and when asked to write in front of the class, his face would flush so red it looked painful. His handwriting, messy and uneven, had become a running joke. His classmates had even coined a nickname for it, Aidenese. Crude copies of his homework would be passed around with exaggerated loops and backward letters, getting laughs that cut deeper than any pencil ever could. But if anyone had looked a little closer, they might have noticed that Aiden never reacted. He didn't cry.
He didn't retaliate.
He just kept writing like he knew something no one else did. That's where the story starts to shift. Because not long before the letter appeared, the one that would end up at the Smithsonian, Aiden had started writing more frequently. Not just school assignments, but pages and pages of notes, stories, questions, even strange little maps tucked into the back pages of his notebooks. One teacher, Mrs. Glenn, had mentioned at a staff meeting that Aiden had begun turning in writing assignments that felt way beyond his age, but most of the staff chalked it up to imagination or maybe something he'd copied from the internet. No one gave it too much thought. But the truth was, Aiden had changed. Something had happened. Something that made him write more obsessively. His mother, Kelly Walker, a single parent working double shifts at the local diner, had noticed it too. She'd find pencil stubs worn down to nothing, spiral notebooks disappearing at a strange rate, ink smudged across his pillowcase where he'd apparently fallen asleep mid-sentence. But when she asked about it, he'd shrug. Just homework, he'd say. Only there was no homework assigned that week. Even more unusual, Aiden had begun sneaking off to the town's small public library on his own. Not the kind of place a lot of 6th graders spend time, especially not ones with no ride and no allowance. But Aiden went, sometimes walking 2 miles alone after school to sit in the quiet corners where old records and microfilms collected dust. The librarian, Mrs. Fernley, an elderly woman with a memory like a steel trap, later told reporters that Aiden had been particularly interested in old local newspapers. Specifically, issues from 1987 to 1993. When asked why, she simply said he told her he was researching something personal. At the time, it seemed innocent, maybe even sweet. But now, looking back, it feels more like a breadcrumb trail. One that leads to a much bigger mystery. Then came the fundraiser day, an event the school held every spring, complete with posters, bake sales, and those decorated boxes where kids were encouraged to drop notes about what freedom meant to them. It was part of a Letters to America initiative, meant to teach civic pride. Most kids scribbled a sentence or two. Some just drew flags. But Aiden's letter was different. It was folded into a precise triangle, like a military flag, and written in the same jagged handwriting he was constantly teased for. He placed it quietly in the box during lunch, and by afternoon, no one even remembered seeing him do it. The box was emptied, letters sorted, and pinned to a bulletin board outside the principal's office. That's where Professor Darnell, a visiting academic from Washington, D.C., who'd been in town for a totally unrelated history project, spotted it. He paused, reread it, then asked for a photocopy. No one thought much of it until days later, when a call came from the Smithsonian's Department of Cultural History. But that's when the weird part started. Because somewhere along the line, someone tried to claim the letter wasn't Aiden's. A boy named Chase, one of the louder, popular kids, insisted that Aiden had copied it from a story online. Another student swore they saw Aiden going through old files in the teacher's lounge, though no one knew how he would have gotten in. And then there were whispers, totally unconfirmed, about Aiden possibly being related to someone important. A man who had vanished decades ago during a civil rights protest. A man whose letters had never been recovered. The town, small and prone to gossip, began buzzing. Some said Aiden had simply plagiarized. Others wondered how a boy with such poor handwriting could suddenly produce something so powerful it moved people to tears. The more questions were asked, the more mysterious the whole situation became. The principal tried to get ahead of it. Meetings were called. Parents grew defensive. Some thought the attention Aiden was receiving was dangerous, unearned. Kids shouldn't be turned into political tools, one parent said during a PTA meeting, their voice shaking. But no one really knew what the letter had said. Only a few had read it. The Smithsonian had sealed it for review, and legal guardianship questions were being raised. Aiden's mom, caught off guard by the sudden media attention, refused to speak publicly, but she did file a request to get the letter back. The museum refused. According to them, the letter had cultural significance that extended beyond personal ownership. But here's the part no one can explain. Just before the story broke nationally, Aiden's library card was flagged for requesting archived documents that were supposed to be restricted. Someone had authorized access from an unknown login. That's when suspicions deepened. Could someone be helping Aiden? Feeding him information? Trying to use him? Or, maybe more unsettling, was he smarter and more aware than anyone gave him credit for? Every clue seems to lead to another dead end. Or worse, to someone who suddenly won't talk. The librarian stopped giving interviews. Professor Darnell canceled his follow-up visit. And a local man, once a community activist, disappeared the day after Aiden's letter was first aired on local news. Police say he left voluntarily, but he didn't even pack a bag. So now, the mystery deepens. Who really wrote the letter? What was Aiden trying to say? And why does it seem like everyone who gets too close to the truth starts backing away? Just when it seemed like the dust was beginning to settle, everything started to fall apart. It began quietly, the kind of shift most people wouldn't notice at first. A missing notebook here, a locked drawer left mysteriously open, a few pages torn from a teacher's grade book. Small things, too small to report, but strange enough to raise eyebrows. Aiden had kept a personal journal, something he wrote in every night without fail. It was filled with rough drafts, sketches, timelines, and bits of old newspaper clippings he'd cut out and glued in. It wasn't just his outlet, it was his map, his evidence, the thing helping him piece everything together. And one day, without warning, it vanished. Just gone. Not from the library, not from school, but from his own room. The bedroom window was still locked, no signs of a break-in, but the journal, the most important piece of this puzzle, had disappeared without a trace. That same week, Aiden started noticing things that made his skin crawl. A car idling too long outside the school parking lot. A strange man who showed up at the library, never checking out books, just sitting there watching. One afternoon, as Aiden was leaving school late after helping a teacher clean up, he found a folded note stuffed into his backpack. No name, no handwriting, just 6 words. Stop digging or you'll regret it. He didn't tell his mother. He didn't tell anyone. But his face changed after that. The spark that had started to show, the quiet confidence he'd begun to build, dimmed again. Still, he didn't stop writing. The investigation into the letter's origins was ongoing, and the Smithsonian had issued a formal statement claiming the letter would remain part of their educational archives pending verification of its historical connections. But the longer the investigation went on, the more tangled it became. An old janitor at the school, Mr. Ellery, came forward one night during a local news interview claiming he remembered something strange. He said that years ago, long before Aiden was born, a former student had written a nearly identical letter, same themes, same language, even similar misspellings. The original, he claimed, was buried under boxes in the school's basement archives, sealed off when the new wing was added in the late 90s. He said he'd seen it with his own eyes. But by the time school officials checked, the archive room had already been cleaned out for asbestos removal, and all the paper records had been disposed of due to mold contamination. Every trace of that letter was gone. Suddenly, the timeline of Aiden's letter wasn't just being questioned, it was under fire. More people began to wonder if Aiden had somehow found the old version and copied it. And when a blurry photo surfaced online showing Aiden holding what looked like a yellowed envelope weeks before the fundraiser, the internet erupted. Reddit threads exploded. TikTok creators started stitching videos with hashtags like #AidenLetterMystery and #Smithsonian The speculation grew louder than the facts. Was Aiden a plagiarist? A plant? Or worse, was someone using him to settle an old score? What made things worse was how quickly the town began to turn. People who had once defended him began to avoid eye contact. His mother was asked not to return to her shift at the diner until things blew over. One of Aiden's teachers, Ms. Rayburn, someone who'd always quietly looked out for him, was put on sudden administrative leave. No reason given. Just gone. It was starting to feel like anyone trying to help him was being systematically pushed aside. Even the professor who had discovered the letter, Dr. Darnell, stopped responding to messages and removed his contact info from the university website. Every lead Aiden tried to follow ended the same way, in silence. Then came the real twist. One night, Aiden was flipping through an old family photo album his mom had kept on the bottom shelf of the hallway closet. Most of the pictures were familiar: birthday parties, school portraits, blurry Christmas mornings. But tucked between two faded pages was a photo he had never seen before. It was black and white, grainy, clearly older than the others. A man with sharp eyes, standing in front of a protest crowd, holding a cardboard sign with handwriting that looked eerily familiar. The same crooked loops. The same slanted capital letters. But what made Aiden freeze wasn't just the writing. It was the patch on the man's jacket. A military badge, with a surname that matched his mother's maiden name. His hands shook as he flipped the photo over. On the back, in faint pencil, were 4 words. For freedom. For Aiden. That was the moment everything changed. Because that man, according to public records, was presumed dead in 1991. But if that was true, why did someone mail the Smithsonian a sealed package just last week, with no return address, no fingerprint, and no digital trail, containing a letter that looked like it had been written by the same hand? And that sealed letter? It hadn't been opened yet. As word of the sealed letter made its way through the town, tensions that had been simmering beneath the surface began to boil over. Reporters started showing up again, lurking outside the school, interviewing neighbors, even following Aiden's mother to the grocery store. The story had reached national interest by now. #Aiden Walker letter was trending across platforms, and a viral podcast episode had just aired, suggesting the boy might be the grandson of a civil rights activist who'd been secretly part of an unsolved FBI case. The Smithsonian refused to comment, citing confidentiality, but the speculation only fueled the fire. And then, almost out of nowhere, a new twist threw everything into chaos. Mrs. Glenn, Aiden's language arts teacher, the same one who had once quietly praised his essays, received an unmarked envelope slipped under her front door. Inside was a single page, torn from a different notebook, with handwriting that looked identical to Aiden's. But the content was darker. This wasn't a letter about hope or freedom, it was more like a warning, or maybe even a confession. The final line simply read, "You were never supposed to see this." At first, Mrs. Glenn thought it had to be some kind of sick prank, maybe one of the kids trying to stir things up. But the more she studied the writing, the more it unnerved her. It wasn't just similar to Aiden's, there were certain quirks only someone deeply familiar with his writing would notice. The way he sometimes pressed harder on his lowercase d when he was nervous. The sharp loop in the G that only showed up when he was rushing. She knew that handwriting. But what really shook her was the date in the corner, marked exactly 1 week in the future. That's when she took it to the principal, and that's when she was told, firmly, to let it go. No explanation. No investigation. Just a vague warning to stay out of it. But Mrs. Glenn didn't stay out of it. She reached out to Aiden's mom and asked to speak with him in private. What she didn't expect was the reaction she got. Aiden refused. Flat out. He wouldn't even look at her. Something had changed in him. He seemed colder now, like he was pulling back into himself, guarding something he wasn't ready to share. And as Mrs. Glenn drove home that evening, She noticed a gray SUV in her rearview mirror, one she swore had been behind her earlier in the week. She took a longer route, pulled into a grocery store lot, and the vehicle disappeared. But the paranoia didn't. Meanwhile, Aiden's mom, Kelly, started getting her own messages. At first, it was just a voicemail. No voice, just static and what sounded like faint clicking in the background. Then came the emails. Anonymous. One of them had a scanned photo attachment that sent chills through her entire body. It was a scan of a birth certificate. Only it wasn't Aiden's. It was hers. And someone had circled the name of her father, a man she'd been told died when she was 7. Below the image was a single typed question. Did you ever really know who he was? She confronted Aiden, thinking maybe he had dug something up without understanding the consequences. But he stayed silent. The kind of silence that doesn't come from fear, but from knowing too much. And then came the piece of evidence that shattered everything the town thought they knew. A former student, now a college freshman, posted a video claiming they had seen the original protest letter during a school history project 5 years earlier. They said it had been part of a sealed time capsule buried under the library's old stone steps. When renovations began last year, the area was dug up, but the capsule was never recovered. The school never acknowledged it. But the student had taken a grainy photo on a flip phone, just enough to make out the same phrase that had appeared in Aiden's letter. Freedom is a voice we bury when we fear the truth. The caption on the social post read, "Don't believe everything you're being told. The letter isn't new. It's just not finished yet." That changed everything. Suddenly, Aiden wasn't just the center of a controversy. He was now the possible key to a multi-decade cover-up. And people started choosing sides. One group insisted the boy was being manipulated by activists trying to resurrect old political wounds. Another group believed he was the rightful heir to a buried message that was never meant to stay hidden. Conspiracy videos began popping up by the hour, some claiming the Smithsonian was suppressing the truth, others suggesting Aiden's letter was a coded message pointing to a classified event from the early 90s. The deeper people looked, the messier it all got. Records disappeared. Names were redacted. A local historian who'd been writing a book about civil protest letters from that era suddenly suspended her research, citing family health concerns, but friends said she'd never been sick. And all this while, Aiden continued writing. Every night, alone, refusing to explain what he was working on, but more determined than ever. He told no one where he was keeping the new pages. He barely ate. He barely slept. One night, Kelly found him sitting in the kitchen in the dark, holding the old black and white photo of the man with a protest sign. She asked him gently what he was thinking. All he said was, "I think they buried more than a letter." That was the moment she realized they were in way over their heads. But just when things couldn't get more confusing, a woman showed up at their door. Not a reporter. Not a neighbor. She said she was with a research group from Washington. She had credentials. She had calm eyes. She said she wanted to help. Said she had once worked with the man in the photo. But she also said something else, something that made Kelly's blood run cold. She looked at Aiden and whispered, "You're not the only one writing these letters." And then she handed him a sealed envelope. Handwriting on the front, same crooked slant, same faint graphite marks. Only this one wasn't addressed to Aiden. It was addressed to someone named Ezra. Who Ezra was or what that letter said, no one knew. Yet. It happened on a Thursday, the kind of ordinary, overcast afternoon that never hints it's about to change your life. Aiden was walking home from school, backpack heavy, hoodie up, head down, when he first noticed the dark sedan crawling along the street behind him. At first he told himself it was just traffic. But it wasn't. The car moved when he moved, slowed when he slowed. At one point, it pulled over to the curb ahead of him, engine idling, windows tinted so dark he couldn't see inside. He crossed to the other side of the street and quickened his pace, heart pounding, palms sweaty. The car didn't follow this time, but as he turned the final corner toward his house, he glanced back. It was still there. Still idling. Like it was waiting. That night, he couldn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards made him sit up. Every gust of wind against the window made his breath catch. He pulled his curtain shut and pushed his desk against the door, not because he thought it would stop anyone, but because it made him feel like maybe, just maybe, he still had some control. The following morning, something far worse happened. Mrs. Glenn, the teacher who had received that threatening page, never showed up to school. No sub, no warning. Her car was still in the driveway when the principal called her home for a wellness check, but she didn't answer. 2 days passed, and still no one had seen or heard from her. A police report was filed, but the story barely made the news. Just another missing adult. No signs of struggle. No leads. No interest. But Aiden knew it wasn't random. And deep down, he knew she had gotten too close. She had seen something or figured something out, and now she was gone. And the way no one seemed to care, that was the part that chilled him to the bone. It wasn't just the fear of what might have happened. It was the realization that whoever was behind all of this was powerful enough to erase someone without leaving a trace. That was when the messages started again. Not texts. Not emails. Physical notes. Folded slips of paper, tucked into his locker, hidden inside his notebooks. Even one slid under his front door in the middle of the night. Always handwritten. Always in the same crooked lettering. Some were short, almost teasing. You don't know what you're part of. Others were darker. Stop asking questions if you want to keep your mother safe. The threats weren't loud or violent. They were calculated. Cold. Like someone who had done this before. Someone who knew how to manipulate fear without ever touching you. Aiden began to question everyone. The librarian who suddenly stopped making eye contact. The neighbor who used to wave, but now looked the other way. Even his best friend, Gabe, had started acting strange, dodging questions, pulling back, always seeming like he wanted to say something but couldn't. When Aiden finally pressed him about it, Gabe confessed that someone had approached his dad late one night, claiming to be from a federal outreach program. They asked questions about Aiden, wanted to know what he talked about, what he wrote about. Gabe's dad had told them nothing. Or at least, that's what Gabe believed. But Gabe also admitted something else. He had found a page from Aiden's journal tucked behind their fence, like someone had dropped it or discarded it during surveillance. The page wasn't just notes or doodles. It was a list of names. Most were people Aiden had never even met. One of them was Mrs. Glenn. And another name? Ezra. That was the breaking point. Aiden couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about a letter anymore. It was about history. Family. Secrets buried so deep they were never meant to be uncovered. He started combing through everything, his mother's old boxes, dusty yearbooks, newspaper clippings. He found old articles about community protests, obscure mentions of activists from decades ago, most of whom had vanished without explanation. One name came up repeatedly, Ezra Marlin, a man who had supposedly gone missing in 1991 under unusual circumstances. He had ties to youth education programs, grassroots civil rights efforts, and a private project involving coded letters meant for posthumous awareness. The project had no official documentation, only vague references in public records and one mention in a declassified FBI file labeled Project Orator. As Aiden dug deeper, he began seeing symbols he didn't understand. On old flyers, on the back of photographs, even carved faintly into the underside of a wooden bench near his school. A strange, spiral-like icon, almost like a fingerprint crossed with an eye. He started noticing it everywhere once he recognized it. And the more he saw it, the more he realized this wasn't random. It was deliberate, coordinated, some kind of network that had been dormant or hiding for decades. He wondered if he was being drawn into it, or if he already had been from the beginning. But the scariest part wasn't the symbols. It wasn't the dark car, the missing teacher, or the cryptic messages. It was the photo that arrived next. A small manila envelope left on their porch, addressed to his mother. No return address. Inside, just one photograph. Black and white. A man, young, mid-20s, standing in front of a burned-out house. His eyes full of fear. In his hand, a letter. The same handwriting. The same crooked loops. Only this photo wasn't old. On the back, a date was scrawled in red ink. It was tomorrow's date, and Aiden's house was in the background. The knock at the door came at 2:13 a.m., sharp, deliberate, like whoever was on the other side knew Aiden was awake. He hadn't slept since the photo arrived. The image of that burned-out house, the letter, the man's eyes, everything about it haunted him. His mom was already downstairs, robe clutched tightly, phone in her hand, ready to dial 911. But something in her face stopped him cold when he reached the last step. It wasn't fear. It was recognition. Like she already knew who was on the other side. She opened the door without a word. And there, standing under the porch light, was the last person Aiden ever expected to see, Mr. Callahan. The janitor from his middle school. Long retired. Practically invisible when he worked there. A guy everyone assumed was just there to mop floors and change light bulbs. But now, he looked different. Serious. Focused. Like he'd just stepped out of a war room. Then came the impossible choice. Mr. Callahan laid it out cold. They had one shot at disappearing. He knew a safe house outside Seattle. Off-grid, scrubbed from satellite records. But to do that, Aiden would have to go dark. No contact with anyone. No phones, no email, no school. Not even his best friend Evan, who still didn't know any of this was happening. Or he could go public. Upload the drive. Release everything. Force the program's existence into the spotlight before they erased it all. But that meant painting a target on his own back. And not just his mom's, too. And maybe even Evan's, if anyone suspected he'd been told. It was a choice with no right answer. Hide and maybe survive, but never know the full truth. Or expose everything and risk everything. And it wasn't theoretical anymore. The power hadn't just gone out. They were being watched. Aiden found a small blinking red light tucked beneath the window frame in his room, an optical mic installed from the outside. His home was compromised. This wasn't a conspiracy anymore. This was real. He had maybe hours, maybe less, before they came for him. The question wasn't whether he could run. It was whether he should. And just as he reached to grab the USB from the laptop, a sharp knock echoed through the house. Not from the front door. From the attic. The knock from the attic wasn't just unexpected, it was impossible. No one had gone up there in years. The door was sealed, the ladder stiff with rust, and yet the sound, sharp, slow, deliberate, kept coming. Aiden's breath caught in his chest as he stared up at the ceiling, his mind racing. Was it someone hiding? Had they been up there all along? Or worse, were they already in the house before the lights went out? Mr. Callahan rushed to the hallway, muttering something under his breath as he scanned the ceiling with a small tactical flashlight. But it was Aiden who climbed the ladder. Slowly. Each creak of the metal felt like a gunshot in the silence. His mother begged him not to, but he had to know. Everything in him screamed that something was up there, something that didn't belong. What he found wasn't a person. Not exactly. It was a box. Old, metal, military-issued. Covered in dust, wedged between beams like it had been deliberately hidden. Inside were papers, photos, and, most disturbingly, multiple class assignments from other kids at his school. Different grades. Different years. But all with the same telltale signs. Strange phrases, historical references that didn't match the curriculum, hand-drawn maps of places that didn't exist anymore. And every paper had one thing in common. A stamp in the top right corner, barely visible in UV light. Echo Seed. These kids weren't just anomalies. They were all part of it. Aiden wasn't the first. He was just the first to write something that triggered public attention. Suddenly, it all started making sense. The strange questions his fifth-grade teacher used to ask, the way the school's psychologist insisted on seeing him alone every other month, even when there was nothing wrong. The memory of the fire drill that ended with a random security sweep of the lockers, and his being completely emptied and relocked with a new code. They hadn't been protecting him. They had been monitoring him, prepping him, watching for when the embedded knowledge would rise to the surface. He climbed down, heart thundering in his chest, only to be met by an unexpected voice in the living room. Evan, his best friend, out of breath, wild-eyed, claiming he'd gotten a text from Aiden asking for help. Except Aiden hadn't texted anyone. His phone was still in airplane mode. Evan's hands were shaking, and when Aiden asked how he got into the house without triggering the alarm, Evan froze. Just for a second, but it was enough. Mr. Callahan stepped between them, demanding answers, and Evan cracked. He wasn't working alone. He didn't even know what he was involved in until it was too late. Someone had approached his parents a month ago, told them Aiden might be in danger. They offered protection, but in return, they wanted access. One of them, a woman named Dr. Quinn, had come to their house, said she was with Homeland Cyber Intelligence, showed credentials, said there was a digital security threat linked to Aiden's email. Evan hadn't questioned it. He'd just done what they asked, installed a diagnostic tool onto Aiden's laptop the last time they hung out, not realizing it was a listening program that opened the entire hard drive to surveillance. Aiden's stomach dropped. The program, the recordings, the message labeled "Listen." They'd been tracking all of it. And worse, Evan admitted it wasn't just about Aiden anymore. They were compiling a list of possible echoes nationwide. Students showing signs of subconscious data replication. They called it the reflection net, a silent algorithm baked into educational software across hundreds of districts. Funded by a private think tank. Aiden's face turned cold. It wasn't a government conspiracy. Not officially. It was a contractor-run operation, one hidden under the guise of academic performance research. They were building something.
Testing something.
And the kids? They were the hard drives. Mr. Callahan moved fast after that. He yanked the power from every device, shoved papers into his backpack, and gave Aiden an ultimatum. They had to go now. They were compromised. Evan, realizing the weight of what he'd done, begged to come with them. But Aiden hesitated. Could he really trust Evan again? Did he really believe he'd been tricked? Or was this a deeper game? One designed to create false trust, just long enough to capture more data? That's when Aiden's mother said something that froze the room. He can't come with us because he's already been activated. The silence that followed was total. Even Evan didn't seem to understand. She continued, her voice trembling. You're not the only one with implanted memories, Aiden. Evan's not just your friend. He was your control subject. The experiment wasn't to see if you'd remember the knowledge. It was to see if he wouldn't. And now both of them were exposed. But to what, they still didn't know. Because while they had been unraveling the mystery inside their own walls, the truth was being uploaded halfway across the country by someone else entirely. They reached the coordinates just as the sun began to break through the early morning haze, casting long, golden shadows over the abandoned government complex buried deep in Virginia's Blue Ridge woods. The building, a weather-worn concrete husk overgrown with ivy and silence, was once a Cold War-era fallout shelter, forgotten by most, repurposed by few. But this wasn't just any bunker. According to the decrypted metadata hidden in the files Aiden had found in the attic, and confirmed by a flash drive mailed anonymously to his house 2 days earlier, this was the original node where Echo Seed began. The letters etched on the rusted entrance door had long since faded, but Aiden's mother knew what they once read. Nova Code I. A black-budget think tank shut down in the 90s after a scandal involving neurological pattern mapping in children. Aiden's stomach twisted as they stepped inside. This place wasn't just the key to the conspiracy. It was the origin of everything. Inside, the air was heavy with mold and memory. The deeper they went, the more the rooms looked like they'd been frozen in time. Old computer banks, scorched projectors, stacks of tapes and film reels labeled in shaky handwriting. The trail led them to a sealed archive, where a massive server, still humming under backup power, blinked quietly in the shadows. And then they found it, the file. Not hidden, not even encrypted. Just labeled July 9th, 2013, subject A09 initiation. Aiden's birthday. When they played it, the sound that came through wasn't static or code. It was a voice, his voice. Reciting words he didn't remember, from a language he didn't recognize, at an age too young to even spell Washington. The hair on his arms rose. This wasn't memory. This was programming. He wasn't just randomly gifted or special. He had been chosen. Created. Then came the moment that shattered everything. A slow clap echoed from the far side of the room. A figure stepped into the dim red glow of the emergency lights. Dr. Quinn. Not a federal agent. Not even a psychologist. She was one of the last original architects of the Echo Seed protocol. Fired from the official program when it was disbanded, but she never stopped the work. She had been orchestrating everything in the background, using proxies like Evan, manipulating families, schools, and even digital learning platforms to reinitiate the test subjects. She'd triggered Aiden's letter to go viral. She'd ensured it reached the Smithsonian. And now she was here for the final piece. "You are the only one who ever wrote the phrase on your own," she said softly, looking directly at Aiden. "All the others needed prompting. You access the syntax naturally. That makes you the perfect convergence point." Mr. Callahan moved protectively between her and Aiden, gun drawn from his coat, his last line of defense. But Dr. Quinn didn't flinch. She simply raised her phone, tapped the screen, and in an instant, Evan, standing just behind them, went stiff. His eyes fluttered like a bad connection. And then he spoke in that same strange language from the tape. He'd been triggered. Evan's body moved unnaturally, hands jerking toward Aiden with a calm, robotic urgency. But Aiden didn't run. He stepped forward. Something inside him had changed. Maybe it was adrenaline. Maybe it was fear. Or maybe, for the first time, he was no longer afraid of who he was. He reached for the pendant his mother had worn for years, an old copper key she always said was from the past. He yanked it from her neck, ran to the console, and jammed it into a slot that shouldn't have existed, but clicked perfectly. The system reacted. Lights flared. Dr. Quinn screamed. The server began dumping files. All of them. Names. Dates. Families. Locations of every child who had ever been touched by Echo Seed. And embedded deep inside the mainframe was the proof, the original contract with the Smithsonian. They had been funding data collection through educational art exhibits for over a decade. That letter? It was planted. The museum was part of the trap. The viral story wasn't just Aiden's rise. It was bait. The power surged as the system self-triggered a purge. Alarms blared. Quinn tried to stop it, lunging for the console, but Callahan fired once, a clean shot to the arm. She went down, screaming. Evan collapsed, disoriented, his body finally releasing from whatever code had hijacked his mind. Aiden caught him before he hit the floor. And then, just as everything seemed to end, the final twist. A second file began to load. One marked Convergence Initiative Phase 2. It wasn't archived. It was active. Real-time coordinates began flashing on the screen. Cities across the U.S., major public schools, each linked to a new version of the Echo algorithm, now repackaged as adaptive AI reading tools. This wasn't over. It was scaling. Aiden turned to his mom, his voice hollow. "We didn't stop it. We just woke it up." And with that, the screen went black. In the weeks that followed, the world began to learn what Aiden and his small, fractured circle had uncovered beneath the surface of their lives. A wave of whistleblower reports and leaked documents flooded the internet, picked up by major networks and investigative YouTubers alike. Hashtags like #EchoSeedFiles, #SmithsonianScandal, and #NeuralMappingKids exploded across social media platforms, and late-night anchors fumbled to explain what it all meant to a stunned public that suddenly realized how little they truly understood about the institutions they trusted. The Smithsonian issued a statement denying any direct knowledge, claiming they had been misled by external contractors involved in the letter's curation. The museum took down the display overnight. But by then it was too late. The footage had already been seen, shared, and archived. The boy with the unusual handwriting had become a symbol, one that no PR campaign could contain. Schools across the country were forced to reevaluate their digital learning tools, especially those using adaptive AI. Parents started asking questions. And underneath all of it was Aiden, caught in the eye of a storm that had begun with ink on paper and spiraled into something far more dangerous. He didn't return to school right away. The building felt too small now, too saturated with buried motives and fake smiles. But he kept writing, every night, in the same weathered notebook he had once hidden under his bed. Only this time, his words weren't guided by an unknown force or a subconscious trigger. They were his. He wrote about the people he loved, the things that scare him, the sound of silence when Evan finally woke up and couldn't remember what he'd done. He wrote about the pain of knowing your memories might not all be your own, and the strange comfort of deciding to make new ones anyway. His mother, now facing a tidal wave of media attention, chose not to speak publicly. She'd said what needed to be said in a handwritten letter of her own, which she sent anonymously to the remaining families named in the purge. That letter, like her son's, found its way into the right hands. And slowly, quietly, a network began to form. Survivors. People once labeled subjects who now understood they weren't alone. Mr. Callahan disappeared after submitting a full dossier to an independent journalist in D.C., choosing exile over fame. Some say he returned to the cabin in West Virginia. Others believe he's working behind the scenes to dismantle the remaining threads of the project. No one knows for sure, and Aiden never asked. Some answers were better left untouched. Evan transferred schools. His parents called it a fresh start, but Aiden knew the truth ran deeper. Evan still had moments, flashes of phrases in that strange language, sudden bursts of emotion with no known cause. They kept in touch through late-night chats and pixelated video calls, sometimes laughing, sometimes crying, always circling around the thing they both knew but rarely said out loud. They had been changed forever. As for the files marked Phase 2, no one knew if they were truly deactivated or simply lying dormant, waiting. Several of the locations pinged on the original server had since gone offline. Others were traced to shell companies and cloud servers too encrypted for even the FBI to crack. Aiden knew it wasn't over. But he also knew that he no longer had to carry it alone. Months later, he walked into the local library to find a quiet place to write, hoping for normalcy. A young girl sat across from him, her backpack covered in stickers, her eyes scanning the page in front of her. She was writing in cursive, real, old-school cursive. Something about it stopped Aiden. The loops. The patterns. The style. It was familiar. She noticed him staring and tilted her head curiously. "My dad says it's weird I like handwriting," she said casually. "But I think it makes things feel real." Aiden smiled, a slow, knowing kind of smile. He reached into his bag and pulled out a pen, scribbling something on the back of his notebook before sliding it across the table. "Never stop," he said. "You never know where one letter can take you." She read the words he'd written, just one sentence, and nodded. But what neither of them saw was the woman standing near the front desk, just out of frame. She wasn't reading. She wasn't even browsing. She was watching. Her coat had no name tag. Her face didn't stand out. But in her hand, tucked discreetly inside her sleeve, was a small copper key, identical to the one Aiden had used to unlock the server. Because sometimes, the story doesn't end when the truth comes out. Sometimes it just writes a new beginning. And that's why you clicked on this video, isn't it? To find out how a simple letter ended up in the Smithsonian.